Rain dragged itself down the courthouse windows in long, trembling streaks, turning the city outside into a blur of silver and ruin. Inside Courtroom 7, the laughter was sharp enough to cut glass. It began with Roman. He leaned back in his chair as though the proceeding had been arranged for his entertainment alone, one arm stretched carelessly across polished oak, his mouth bending into that familiar smile Vivien had once mistaken for warmth. "Your Honor," he said, voice soaked in velvet contempt, "my former wife wants the court to believe she was an equal partner in my success." The gallery erupted. It was not polite laughter. It was open, delighted, communal laughter, the kind that feeds on a victim's inability to answer back. A woman near the rear covered her mouth and failed to hide her grin. Two junior associates at Kenneth Dre's table exchanged glances and smirked. Even the bailiff's expression flickered, almost betraying amusement, before discipline flattened it again. Sloane let out a bright, crystalline laugh and crossed one elegant leg over the other. "Equal partner?" she repeated under her breath, but loud enough for half the room to hear. "Oh, that is adorable." More laughter. Vivien sat alone at the petitioner's table in a charcoal chair that seemed colder than the marble walls. She did not touch the water in front of her. Her hands remained folded so neatly in her lap they could have belonged to a portrait rather than a living woman. Only the pulse at the base of her throat betrayed that she heard every word. Kenneth adjusted his glasses and approached the center. "Mrs. Ashford appears to confuse attending galas with building companies," he said. "Hosting dinners is not governance. Choosing wallpaper is not capital structuring, and wearing a wedding ring is not ownership." The room flashed with another wave of amusement. Roman chuckled, low and satisfied, as though the entire institution of law had gathered this morning merely to confirm what he had always insisted in private, that Vivien was ornamental, emotional, dependent, and finished. Vivien lowered her eyes for one brief second. On the polished table, the reflections trembled, the overhead lights, Kenneth's moving hands, Roman's smug grin, and her own face, composed almost to the point of cruelty. Clear's throat. She looked like a woman being erased in public, and that was exactly why they were so loud. Because cruel people only become theatrical when they are certain the person before them cannot destroy them. They did not know that silence, in the right woman, is often the last locked room before the avalanche. Kenneth Dre had the kind of voice that made even lies sound embossed. He walked before the bench with measured elegance, every sentence sharpened for maximum humiliation, every pause designed to let the audience enjoy itself. "Let us review reality," he said, lifting a document with 2 fingers, as though it smelled faintly of embarrassment. Mrs. Ashford held no executive title in Ashford Urban Capital, no controlling vote, no management position, no public record of strategic authority, no independent income worthy of note. He set the paper down. What she did possess, he continued, was access. Access to a husband who mistook sentiment for generosity. A hush. Then laughter again, uglier because it came after restraint. Roman smiled at the table like a man accepting applause at a private premiere. Sloane touched his sleeve and tilted her head toward Vivien with theatrical pity. "Poor thing," she whispered. She really thought sitting beside power made her powerful. Vivien stared ahead. Kenneth turned toward her. "Mrs. Ashford, would you care to tell the court what exactly you contributed to the acquisition of Blackwell Terrace?" Vivien lifted her eyes slowly. "I lived there." Snickering broke instantly through the room. Kenneth gave a soft smile meant to mimic courtesy. "Yes, you lived there, in the penthouse your husband purchased," Roman added, not even bothering to hide his voice. "And redecorated 3 times. That drew a louder burst. One of the women in the gallery muttered, "Imagine being that useless and still ungrateful." Judge Helena Ward struck her gavel once. Order, but the damage had already spread. Humiliation is contagious when the crowd senses permission. Kenneth pressed on. "Did you negotiate financing for the property?" "No." "Did you structure the debt?" "No." "Did you source the investors?" "No." "Did you attend the closing?" Vivien's jaw tightened. "No." Kenneth inclined his head as though they had arrived at truth together. "Then your contribution was emotional decoration, not ownership." The phrase hung in the room like perfume on rot. Sloane laughed openly this time, her earrings glittering under the courtroom lights. "Emotional decoration. Kenneth? That is devastating." Roman didn't even look at Vivien when he spoke. "That was basically the marriage." A few people gasped, then laughed anyway. Vivien felt heat rise behind her ribs, not the frantic heat of panic, but the heavy, airless heat of old pain opening its eyes. There had been a time Roman never mocked her in public. He had saved it for late evenings, for closed doors, for the elegant cruelty of a man who preferred to bruise where no one could testify. "You embarrass too easily," he used to say. "Why won't you speak properly? Why do you always look wounded?" wounded. And later, when Sloane entered their lives disguised as a consultant, his disdain became bolder, more social, more polished. Vivien had watched herself become a private joke before she became a public one. Kenneth held up printed photos from charity events. Here we have Mrs. Ashford at the Winter Regent Ball, in couture, smiling. Here at the Marlowe Arts dinner, smiling. Here aboard the Capri fundraising yacht, smiling. He faced the bench. Not one image of labor, not one record of authorship, merely attendance, luxury, visibility. Roman leaned forward, voice dripping with mock sympathy. She was very good at smiling for pictures. I'll give her that. Another round of laughter hit the paneled walls and came back meaner. Kenneth turned abruptly. And isn't it true, Mrs. Ashford, that in the final year of the marriage, while my client was expanding his portfolio, you spent nearly 6 months out of sight? Vivien's fingers tightened in her lap. Yes, she said quietly. Recovering from what? Kenneth asked. Her silence lasted a beat too long. Sloane smirked. Roman's smile sharpened. Kenneth answered for her. From emotional instability. According to private medical consultations submitted under seal, the room changed. Not softer, crueler. The laughter this time was different, less explosive, more intimate, more poisonous. Heads tilted. Eyes narrowed. A few people leaned closer, scenting weakness. Roman exhaled through his nose in amused disbelief, as if even her pain had inconvenienced him. She vanished, he said, while I handled everything. Vivien swallowed. The truth sat like broken glass behind her teeth. She had not vanished because she was unstable. She had vanished because grief had hollowed her after discovering Roman's betrayal the same week she lost the child he had once sworn he wanted. She had bled in silence while he attended investor dinners. She had signed condolence flowers to herself because he sent none. But this was not yet the moment. Kenneth seized the silence like prey. Your Honor, my client requests that Mrs. Ashford's petition for equitable division be denied in full. She has mistaken proximity for participation, luxury for labor, and marriage for entitlement. Roman leaned back, satisfied. Sloane murmured, maybe she can sue for the handbags. Even Judge Ward's stern stare could not stop the murmuring now. The gallery had chosen its role. They were no longer spectators. They were a chorus, and at the center of it sat Vivien, motionless, beneath the weight of collective contempt, like a woman being lowered alive into the grave they had prepared for her reputation. Outside, thunder rolled over the city. Inside, nobody noticed that she had finally raised her head. If humiliation has a sound, it is public laughter. If power has a sound, it is silence arranged with precision. Vivien had learned the difference long before Roman Ashford ever touched her life. She was born a Laurent, the last granddaughter of Corinne Laurent, the elusive founder of Laurent Sovereign Holdings, a quiet web of trusts, logistics firms, debt vehicles, ports, agricultural patents, private real estate, and sovereign-grade advisory contracts hidden behind layers of discreet legal architecture, so elegant most rivals never realized they were dealing with one empire. Corinne believed noise was for salesmen and fools. If they can measure your power, she used to tell Vivien as they walked through the winter rose gardens of Laurent House, they can build a weapon against it. So Vivien learned to speak only when the room had already miscalculated her. At 26, while Roman was still collecting magazine covers, and calling himself self-made, Vivien was restructuring distressed shipping debt through a Luxembourg holding arm under a maiden signature no gossip column had ever printed. At 28, she had designed the contingency trust that later protected Laurent Sovereign from an international tax ambush. At 30, she was the invisible architect behind 3 acquisitions Roman publicly boasted about over champagne. He never knew the woman at the end of those midnight conference calls. The one whose voice was altered through encrypted routing was his own wife sitting barefoot in the dark library 2 floors below their bedroom. He liked brilliance best when he could take credit for its outcome. When Roman proposed, Vivien knew exactly what he was. Dazzling, ambitious, hungry enough to call cruelty discipline. But her grandmother had just died, and grief can make even intelligent women long for warmth disguised as certainty. Roman gave her spectacle, then against her, never realizing every bridge he crossed had been financed with timber she owned. Vivien had watched him carefully. She watched him underestimate compliance. She watched him move assets through shell entities he thought were clever, never noticing the parent instruments belonged to Laurent Sovereign's quiet subsidiaries. She watched him refinance properties through lending vehicles approved by boards that answered ultimately to Auguste Laurent. She watched him parade Sloane through hotel lobbies and private clubs, unaware that the penthouse he rented for his mistress was held by an off-market real estate arm Vivien had established before the marriage. She watched Kenneth Dre accept retainers funded through a discretionary litigation reserve seeded from Vivien's trust under a neutral corporate name He never bothered to investigate. Roman believed concealment was the same thing as control. It was not. The year he said she had vanished, Vivien had indeed disappeared. From galas, from charity columns, from the ornamental wife-shaped life he preferred. But in that silence, she had done three things. First, she had survived. The child she lost was a daughter. Roman never knew that. He signed the clinic forms without reading them, took a call in the corridor, and left before she opened her eyes fully from sedation. Vivien understood in that white room, with rain on the hospital window and the taste of iron in her mouth, that whatever softness remained in her marriage would die there too. She buried it privately. Second, she had mapped everything. Every transfer, every shell, every personal indulgence billed through corporate expense, every apartment keycard, every offshore invoice, every whisper trail between Roman and Sloane. She did not rage. She catalogued. Grief made her quiet. Betrayal made her exact. Third, she built the net. Not for revenge alone, though revenge would come, immaculate and deserved, but for containment. Roman was reckless. If cornered, he would scorch every asset he could reach. So Vivien moved first. She tightened loan covenants through proxy boards. She bought secondary debt on Ashford Urban through silent funds. She inserted automatic triggers into liquidity facilities. She reacquired diluted rights he had assumed were irrelevant. She strengthened the pre-marital trust language around every piece of land, every share, every licensing agreement he had confused for his own ambition made manifest. By the time he filed for divorce, confident, adulterous, eager to humiliate her into accepting a skeletal settlement, Vivien already knew the outcome. She allowed the mockery because arrogance expands when unwatched. She needed Roman loud. She needed Kenneth careless. She needed Sloane ornamental and overconfident. She needed the courtroom to see them in full light before the architecture of truth descended on their heads. Auguste Laurent had objected, of course. "You owe them no theatre," he had said 2 nights before the trial in the private boardroom high above Laurent Tower. The city below had glowed like a tray of scattered diamonds. "We can end this in chambers." Vivien stood by the glass, one hand curled around a crystal tumbler of untouched water. "No," she had said. "He performed my humiliation socially. He will meet the truth socially." Auguste studied her reflection. "Are you prepared?" Vivien looked at the storm gathering beyond the skyline. "I have been prepared since the day he mistook my silence for surrender." And now, in Courtroom 7, while Kenneth Dre painted her as decorative waste, and Roman lounged in the false sunlight of his own applause, Vivien sat with the entire invisible world still at her back. Directors, deeds, signature authorities, dormant clauses, board resolutions, controlling interests, registered trusts, emergency injunctions, and a final sealed packet waiting only for the signal. She looked powerless, because power, when properly bred and properly wounded, rarely arrives shouting. Sometimes it arrives in an ivory blouse, with tired eyes and steady hands, and lets the room laugh until everyone who should be listening has exposed themselves. Clears throat. Then it stands. By midday, Roman carried himself like a crowned man. The storm outside had darkened the windows to smoked glass, but inside, his confidence brightened him with almost vulgar ease. He whispered to Kenneth, nodded at spectators, even smiled at a business columnist seated in the back as though this were not a divorce proceeding, but a carefully managed public relations victory. When court resumed after recess, Sloane returned with fresh lipstick and the serene cruelty of someone who had spent the break reading favorable reactions on her phone. "She still hasn't said anything meaningful," Sloane murmured, settling beside Roman. "I told you, she doesn't have the stomach for this." Roman's mouth tilted. "She never did." Kenneth rose and delivered his next argument like a closing aria. He spoke of Roman's singular industrial discipline, of measurable contribution, of emotional opportunism. He framed Vivien not merely as uninvolved but parasitic, a woman who drifted through wealth she neither understood nor deserved. Every phrase was engineered to make her look smaller than the last. Then came the settlement offer. "Without prejudice," Kenneth announced, "my client remains willing to provide Mrs. Ashford with transitional support, 12 months rent on a modest apartment, use of one vehicle currently titled under Ashford Urban Fleet, and a discretionary personal allowance contingent upon non-disparagement." The gallery stirred. It was an insult dressed as mercy. Roman clasped his hands and looked at Vivien for the first time in several minutes. "Take it," he said softly, almost kindly, which made it crueler. "You won't do better." Sloane smiled as if she were watching charity at work. "Honestly, Vivien, that's more generous than most people would be after what you've put him through." "What you've put him through." The sentence landed in the room and stayed there, absurd and effective. That was Roman's genius. Not truth, but atmosphere. If he said a lie with enough composure, people rearranged their instincts around it. So Kenneth added, Frankly, Mrs. Ashford should consider the reputational cost of prolonging this matter. Further testimony may not reflect favorably on her, a threat lacquered to legal shine. Judge Ward narrowed her eyes. Counselor, watch your tone. Of course, Your Honor. Roman exhaled and leaned back, already savoring the end. I tried to make her life easy, he said to the court. I gave her everything. Beautiful home, travel, security, respect. His jaw flexed once. She repaid me with bitterness. Vivien almost laughed. Respect. There are words so thoroughly violated by the mouths that speak them, they become unrecognizable. Sloane placed a hand over her heart in mock tenderness. Some women don't know when they've been blessed. A few spectators chuckled again, more cautiously now, but still with enough boldness to sting. Roman's confidence swelled with each small victory. His voice grew richer, looser, more personal. He was no longer arguing a case. He was enjoying domination. He spoke of Vivien's fragility, her unrealistic self-image, her dependence. He spoke as though he had invented her life and could therefore repossess it. And through it all, Vivien remained still. The stillness unsettled no one yet. They read it as defeat. That was their final mistake before the floor beneath them opened. Cruelty always wants an encore. It came near 4 in the afternoon, when fatigue had thinned the room's formality and people had begun to crave a spectacle strong enough to keep them alert. Rain tapped the windows like impatient fingers. Papers rustled. The fluorescent lights hummed. Somewhere in the back, just someone stifled a yawn. Kenneth looked down at his notes, then up at Vivien with surgical calm. One final line of inquiry, Your Honor. Judge Ward nodded. Kenneth approached. Mrs. Ashford, since you maintain you are entitled to substantial division of assets, kindly tell this court what employment you are qualified to obtain independent of my client's name. The question was simple. That was why it was vicious. A ripple passed through the gallery. Vivien lifted her gaze. Kenneth's expression remained smooth, but his eyes glittered. He was offering the room a smaller, sharper knife than before. The intimate humiliation of forcing a woman publicly cast out of luxury to imagine her own survival. Roman smiled before she answered. Sloane didn't even bother pretending not to enjoy it. Vivien said nothing. Kenneth waited half a beat, then asked, would you classify yourself as administrative support, event hostess, domestic manager? A laugh cracked from somewhere near the rear. Roman added, she was always better with flowers than figures. That one brought the room down harder than anything else all day. Real laughter. Full-bodied, head-tipping, shoulder-shaking laughter. Sloane covered her mouth and failed magnificently to contain herself. One of Kenneth's associates bent over his legal pad. Even people who had been quiet until now surrendered to the momentum of collective mockery, because once a room decides a woman is ridiculous, decency becomes socially expensive. Vivien felt the sound wash over her, hot, humiliating, endless. She remembered Roman once standing behind her at a charity dinner, his lips near her ear, murmuring, oh, smile, darling, you're decorative at your best. When you don't think too loudly. She had smiled then. She did not smile now. Sloane looked her over slowly, as one might inspect an item being cleared from a boutique display. If she needs work, she said lightly. I know 2 households looking for discreet staff. The laughter this time came with gasps. Judge Ward struck the gavel sharply. That is enough. But Roman was grinning too broadly to stop himself. Keep the china, Vivien, he said. You always loved arranging things. Something changed in the air. It was not visible at first. It did not announce itself. It arrived in the way Vivien's shoulders straightened by a fraction, in the way her hand finally moved from her lap to the sealed leather folder beside her, in the way the pulse in her throat disappeared. She rose. Since the courtroom quieted, not out of respect, but out of curiosity, the way a crowd grows still when a cornered animal finally stands. Vivien placed one hand on the table and looked directly at the bench, Clear's throat. Your Honor, she said, her voice low, level, and terrifyingly clear. I believe the respondents are finished confusing me with someone they were allowed to humiliate. And for the first time all day, Roman stopped smiling. The silence that followed was small, almost fragile. It lasted less than 3 seconds. Then Kenneth recovered first, because men like Kenneth Dre build careers on recovering first. Your Honor, he said with a faintly dismissive laugh. If Mrs. Ashford intends a speech, it is not a speech, Vivien replied. She opened the leather folder. So the sound of the clasp unfastening seemed absurdly loud. It is a correction. From the rear doors of the courtroom came movement, measured, synchronized, unmistakably deliberate. Heads turned. The room shifted. The heavy oak doors opened, and Auguste Laurent entered with the calm gravity of a man who had never once rushed for anyone in his life. Beside him walked Naomi Quinn, silver-haired, immaculate, one of the most feared restructuring attorneys in the country. Behind them came a forensic accountant with sealed binders, a court clerk carrying supplemental filings, and 2 representatives from Blackwell Private Bank. Even Kenneth paled. Roman frowned, annoyance flashing before comprehension. "What is this?" Naomi Quinn did not look at him. "Supplemental emergency submission. Already lodged with Chambers 27 minutes ago," she said to the bench, "related to standing, beneficial ownership, fraudulent concealment, and material misrepresentation." Judge Ward straightened. "Ms. Quinn?" "Yes, Your Honor. I now appear for Mrs. Vivien Laurent Ashford." The room reacted as one organism. Sharp breaths, shifting bodies, a rustle of alarm beneath decorum. Kenneth stepped forward. "This is highly irregular." Naomi's expression did not change. "So is arguing a property division case while failing to disclose that nearly every major asset named by your client sits under structures my client owned before the marriage." Nothing in the courtroom moved. Nothing. It was the kind of stillness that comes not from calm, but from impact. Roman's face hardened. That's absurd." Vivien turned at last and looked at him fully. It was not the look of a wounded wife. It was the look of a sovereign witness, finally willing to acknowledge a trespasser. "Is it?" she asked. Naomi began laying out documents with frightening efficiency. Exhibits transferred, screens activated, corporate trees illuminated across the courtroom monitors, boxes, dates, arrows, entities nested within entities, so elegantly that several people in the gallery blinked as if trying to wake from a dream too technical to be dangerous. Auguste Laurent took the stand. Roman's eyes narrowed. He knew Auguste only socially, the severe older relative who rarely attended Ashford functions and almost never spoke. Roman had once referred to him as the family relic. The memory arrived now like poison. Naomi approached. "Hey, state your name." "Auguste Laurent." "Your role?" "Chairman of Laurent Sovereign Holdings and primary trustee of the Laurent Continuity Trust." Naomi turned to the bench. "Your Honor, with the court's permission, I would like to establish beneficial ownership over the properties and instruments repeatedly described today as the sole achievements of Mr. Roman Ashford." "Proceed." Naomi nodded once. "Mr. Laurent, who funded the original acquisition vehicle for Blackwell Terrace, Laurent Sovereign Holdings, through LSH Residential Armature 2, a stir in the gallery." Naomi continued. "And who is the ultimate beneficial owner of LSH Residential Armature 2? Auguste did not even glance at Roman. "Vivien Laurent Ashford, formerly Vivien Laurent, beneficiary, controller, and signatory authority established 4 years before marriage." Roman's chair scraped. Kenneth rose instantly. "Objection. We need authentication." Naomi lifted a notarized packet. "Already supplied. Chain of custody verified. Banking confirmations attached. Would counsel like me to continue slowly?" A few spectators actually looked embarrassed now, but no one dared make a sound. Naomi walked to the display screen. "Let us begin gently. Blackwell Terrace, the penthouse Mr. Ashford called his, owned through an LSH pre-marital real estate subsidiary, beneficially controlled by Mrs. Ashford. The Belgrave Vineyard Retreat Mr. Ashford listed as his leisure asset. Same structure, the fleet vehicles, leased through Laurent Logistics Financing, the art-secured lending line that capitalized Ashford Urban's second expansion phase. Guaranteed by Laurent Sovereign, the bridge debt on Marlow North, purchased on the secondary market by Laurent Sovereign 18 months ago, the private equity feeder fund Mr. Ashford cited in 3 public interviews as proof of investor confidence, seeded by a Laurent discretionary strategic vehicle. With each sentence, Roman seemed to lose color by degree. Sloane looked from screen to screen, then at Roman, smiling weakly, as though someone should explain the joke. Naomi did not stop. The Diamond Key Hotel parcel, controlled by Vivien's trust, the Ravenscourt office building housing Ashford Urban Headquarters, ground lease held by a Laurent property arm, the personal residence currently occupied by Mr. Ashford's companion, Miss Sloane Whitmore. Sloane snapped upright. "Excuse me." Naomi turned, almost polite. "Leased through Whitmore Lifestyle Accommodations, LLC, whose parent debt was acquired by Laurent Sovereign 6 months ago after covenant breach. In ordinary language, Ms. Whitmore, my client can have you removed." A gasp cut through the courtroom. Sloane's mouth opened, then shut. Roman stood. "This is a stunt." Vivien's eyes never left him. "No, Roman. The stunt was letting you call yourself self-made while you built your life on a staircase I paid for." The line hit like thunder. For a moment, even Judge Ward seemed to forget the gavel in her hand. Kenneth found his voice. "Even if some historical funding link exists, that does not establish direct ownership over current holdings." Naomi smiled for the first time. It was not a pleasant smile. "Then let us discuss current holdings." The forensic accountant took the stand. Or for 90 breathless minutes, numbers became execution. He walked the court through shell entities Roman had used to obscure distributions, only to discover those entities were management wrappers, not ownership caps. He identified signature authorities Roman had treated as ceremonial: Vivien's signature, Vivien's authorizations, Vivien's trust approvals. He showed board resolutions triggered upon marital misconduct involving misuse of protected assets. He showed Roman's transfer attempts after filing for divorce and the automatic freezes they activated. He showed Kenneth's retainer chain and the source reserve from which it had been drawn. Kenneth's face changed then. It was subtle at first, a tightening around the mouth, a stillness in the jaw. Was the dawning horror of a man realizing the money funding his most aggressive performance in court may have originated from the woman he had spent the day humiliating. Naomi let that realization ripen before speaking. "For clarity," she said, turning toward Kenneth, "the litigation reserve that paid your initial retainer appears to have been capitalized by a neutral strategic account. The parent reserve is a Laurent-controlled asset, meaning," she looked back at the bench, "Mrs. Ashford may have financed the privilege of being mocked today." No one laughed. No one even breathed correctly. Roman stared at Vivien, as though looking at a stranger formed in the shape of his wife. "You're lying." Vivien tilted her head slightly. "That's the difficulty with marrying a quiet woman, Roman. Now, you never know how much she understood while you were busy explaining her life to her." He took a step forward. "You let me." "Yes," she said, one word, barely above a whisper, and somehow that was worse for him than anger would have been. "Yes, I let you talk. I let you perform. I let you file. I let you swear under oath that properties, vehicles, debt facilities, and strategic interests were yours outright. I let Ms. Whitmore parade through an apartment I could have closed by email. I let Mr. Dre build a case with documents he never had the sophistication to trace. I let this room laugh." Her voice remained calm, but now there was something luminous in it. Pain turned flawless, grief cut into glass. "Do you know why?" Roman said nothing. "Because people reveal themselves best when they think the cost of cruelty is zero." Rain thundered suddenly against the windows, harder now, as if the weather itself had leaned in to listen. Naomi submitted the final packet. "Your Honor, in light of the evidence, we move for immediate recognition that the principal assets listed by respondent are not marital property in the manner represented, but protected premarital and trust-controlled assets beneficially owned by Mrs. Vivien Laurent Ashford. We also request sanctions for concealment, a freeze on disputed transfers, referral for forensic review regarding fiduciary abuse, and temporary occupancy orders concerning any residence currently maintained through Laurent-controlled entities." Judge Ward's expression had gone from irritation to icy concentration. She read, "Asked questions, received confirmations, verified dates, examined signatures, compared filings." With every page, the emotional weather of the room changed. Shock became fear, fear became panic. Sloane leaned toward Roman, voice trembling for the first time all day. "Roman, what does this mean?" He did not answer, because he knew. It meant the cars were hers. The homes were hers. The headquarters he entered each morning was hers by leasehold chain. The capital that legitimized his rise had been hers before his name ever appeared in a business journal. Even the image of himself he cherished most, the titan, the builder, the husband burdened by a weak wife, had been financed by the very woman he reduced to decorative silence. Kenneth tried once more. "Your Honor, surely there is room for interpretation in layered corporate structures." Judge Ward cut through him like a blade. "There is room for very little, Counselor, when certified ownership, trust priority, banking confirmation, board authority, and premarital control all point in the same direction." Kenneth sat down. That, more than anything, frightened the gallery. Men like Kenneth Dry were not supposed to go quiet. Vivien remained standing. The overhead lights gleamed on the silver edge of her eyes. She did not look triumphant in the vulgar sense. She looked something much more devastating, vindicated without needing to raise her voice. Roman's arrogance finally cracked wide enough for desperation to show through. "Vivien," he said, and now her name sounded wrong in his mouth, stripped of possession. "Why didn't you tell me?" A pulse moved once in her cheek. "You never asked to know me," she said. "You only asked what I could be for you." The line left him visibly hit. Sloane shook her head, color draining from her face. "Roman told me you were just—" Vivien turned toward her, not cruelly. That would have been easier to dismiss. She turned with the clean finality of truth. "Convenient," Vivien said. "Forgettable? Decorative? He confuses softness with absence. Many people do. It is a very expensive mistake." Sloane looked down at her diamond bracelet as though it had suddenly become a shackle. Naomi passed one last document to the clerk. "Your Honor, there is one more matter." Judge Ward glanced up. "Go on." "The governing morality clause in the Laurent Continuity Trust allows immediate revocation of spousal privileges, access rights, and derivative lifestyle support upon proven infidelity involving trust-funded assets. We have submitted the evidence. Roman actually swayed. Naomi's voice stayed exquisitely neutral. Effective at 6 p.m. today, respondent loses access to Blackwell Terrace, the Ashford Driver account, the Belgrave Retreat, and all discretionary cards linked to Laurent reserves. Pending further orders, Ashford Urban's primary lines will also be subject to covenant review. It was too much for the room to absorb at once. Gasps, papers falling, someone whispering, "Oh my God," someone else muttering, "He's ruined." Roman stared at Vivien, as though willing the world back into his shape. "Please," he said, and the word came out raw. It was the first honest thing he had said all day. Vivien's face did not soften. Thus, this was not because she had become cruel, it was because she finally understood the difference between mercy and permission. "You laughed," she said very quietly now. "All of you laughed, while I sat here and let you decide what kind of woman silence makes. Weak, dependent, disposable." Her gaze shifted briefly across the gallery, and people actually lowered their eyes. "You were all so comfortable with humiliation when you believed it would never reverse." Clear's throat. Then she looked back at Roman. "The truth is simpler. You were living in my world. You were spending my money. You were sleeping in my houses. You were building your legend on my foundation." She took one step forward. "And today, in front of everyone you wanted to impress, yet you learned the only thing more dangerous than a powerful woman," her voice dropped to a velvet edge, "is a powerful woman you taught to stop loving you." No one moved. Judge Ward called a recess, but the words sounded distant, almost ceremonial. The real ruling had already fallen in the room's bloodstream. Roman sat down slowly, like a man who had just discovered gravity. Sloane stared ahead, blinking too fast. Kenneth removed his glasses and did not know where to look, and Vivien, who had entered that courtroom as their favorite object of ridicule, stood in the center of their silence like the final line of a verdict no appeal could survive. When the courtroom emptied for recess, nobody left with the ease they had carried in. The air itself seemed heavier, packed with the aftertaste of revelation and the raw embarrassment of having laughed too soon. Those who had mocked her in whispers now moved in whispers. Those who had smiled broadly now kept their mouths arranged in neutral lines, as if composure could erase participation. It could not. Rain had softened outside. The windows now held the city in bruised violet light, dusk beginning to gather between towers. Inside, paper cups, abandoned notes, and half-finished arguments lay scattered across tables like debris after weather. Roman remained seated long after Kenneth stood. His face had lost its polish. Not the beauty, men like Roman seldom lose that first, but the coating, the certainty, the expensive illusion that force of personality can substitute for truth. And he stared at the darkened monitor where the ownership chains had glowed minutes before, as though willing the diagrams to rearrange into his favor. Kenneth touched his shoulder once. "We need to discuss exposure." Roman did not answer. Roman, still nothing. Across the room, Sloane stood alone near the aisle, one hand wrapped around the strap of her handbag so tightly the knuckles had whitened. Her glamour had become effortful. She kept looking at her phone, likely waiting for reassurance from assistants, friends, agents, anyone who might confirm that this was survivable if styled correctly. But scandal feels very different when the floor beneath your shoes belongs to the woman you mocked. Finally, she crossed toward Roman. "You told me she was out," Sloane said, voice low, unsteady. "Yeah, you told me she had nothing." Roman dragged a hand over his face. "I thought—" "You thought?" The laugh that escaped her was broken, frightened. "Roman, I moved into that apartment because you said it was yours." Kenneth turned sharply. "Ms. Whitmore, now is not the time." "When is the time?" she snapped, all polish gone. "When I'm escorted out by building security?" That possibility landed between them with disgusting clarity. Roman stood then, too quickly. Enough. But the command no longer carried its old force. Sloane stepped back as though hearing it herself. For the first time since entering his life, she looked at him not as a prize, not as a ladder, not as a desirable man in temporary inconvenience, but as risk. That was the true collapse. Not money, not access, not property, loss of atmosphere, a loss of the invisible social field in which Roman Ashford had always seemed inevitable. At the far end of the courtroom, Vivien stood near the bench, speaking quietly with Naomi Quinn and Auguste Laurent. She did not turn toward the spectacle behind her. That somehow made it worse. Had she gloated, Roman might have found a way to hate her cleanly, but her refusal to feed on his humiliation left him alone with it. He walked toward her anyway. Kenneth hissed, "Don't." Roman ignored him. Vivien sensed him before he reached her. She turned with calm so complete it made his desperation look theatrical. "Vivien," he said. Naomi stepped back. August remained where he was, silent as a monument. Roman swallowed. His eyes moved over Vivien's face as if searching for the woman he had controlled. as the woman who looked down and apologized and accepted reinterpretation. He did not find her. "I didn't know," he said. The words were pathetic. He heard it as he said them. Vivien's expression remained unreadable. "That is not a defense. It is your confession." He flinched. "I didn't know," he repeated, quieter now. "Because you never—" "Never what?" she asked. "Boasted, interrupted, branded myself, performed intelligence in rooms full of men who would only respect it if it arrived in their own tone." Roman's eyes dropped for a fraction of a second. "There it is," Vivien said softly. "The first honest silence you've ever given me." He looked wrecked then, not ruined yet in the financial sense. That would come through filings, freezes, press, lenders, reviews, but morally disassembled. But the architecture of his superiority had cracked, and through it one could finally see the smaller, hungrier man inside. "I was angry," he said. "You shut me out." Vivien's voice turned colder. "I protected what was mine from a man who believed intimacy was entitlement." He opened his mouth, closed it, then tried the oldest refuge of weak men cornered by strong women. "I did love you." The sadness that crossed her face then was the only mercy he received. "No," she said. "You loved being enlarged by me." Behind Roman, Sloane had gone still. Kenneth looked away. In the gallery, a woman who had laughed earlier lowered her head as if ashamed to be seen at all. Judge Ward re-entered and called the room back to order for interim rulings. The legal consequences were delivered in measured language. But the emotional punishment had already done its work. Asset review, temporary restraint, production deadlines, occupancy restrictions, conduct warnings, referral notices. Each phrase landed like a lock turning. By the time the session closed, the courtroom that had once thundered with mockery had been reduced to the smallest sounds. Heels on marble, papers gathered softly, breathing held too carefully, doors opening and shutting with almost reverent restraint. The storm had passed, and in its wake stood the terrible, cleansing dignity of a woman no one in that room would ever dare mistake for powerless again. 3 months later, dawn poured liquid gold over Laurent Tower. The city reflected itself in its glass skin, clean, vertical, ambitious. Inside the top-floor boardroom, Vivien stood at the head of a long table of pale stone and dark walnut, signing the final documents for a new foundation dedicated to maternal recovery care and financial legal defense for women emerging from coercive marriages. Her hair was down today, soft waves at her shoulders. Her suit was cream. Her face was peaceful in a way that has nothing to do with forgetting, and everything to do with surviving correctly. Below her, the city moved on. Ashford Urban had entered restructuring under intense scrutiny. Kenneth Dre's firm faced formal review over disclosure failures. Sloane Whitmore, stripped of access to Roman's illusion, had retreated from every camera that once loved her, and Roman now knew what silence sounded like when it no longer feared him. Vivien did not spend her mornings thinking about him. That was the final revenge. August placed a folder before her. "The foundation launch is confirmed," Vivien signed. "Good." He studied her for a moment. "And how do you feel?" She looked out at the skyline, where the clouds had opened just enough for sunlight to strike the river in one long blade of silver. "Unmistakable," she said, clear as throat. "That is the lesson, isn't it? Never confuse a quiet woman with an empty one. Never mistake grace for dependence, patience for ignorance, softness for surrender. Some women do not answer every insult because they are weak. Some women stay silent because they are choosing the exact hour your arrogance will become evidence. Some women do not need to shout their power. They simply wait until the world has fully exposed its contempt. Then they rise. And every cruel voice in the room learns how expensive mockery can become. If this story gripped you, tell me in the comments. Have you ever seen someone underestimate the quietest person in the room? At what moment did you know Roman's downfall was coming? If you were Vivien, would you have revealed the truth sooner or waited for the public reversal? And if you believe in stories where dignity fights back, where humiliation turns into justice, and where powerful women reclaim the air people tried to steal from them, subscribe, stay close, and step into the next revenge drama with me. Because on this channel, the laughter never belongs to the cruel for long. It belongs to the woman who outlasts them. And in the end, she always owns more than they ever imagined.